The canyon floor was eerily silent as Sergeant Marcus Webb led Slate 12 deeper into the jagged terrain, their boots crunching softly against loose gravel scattered across the ancient stone. The sun was bleeding orange across the horizon, painting the rocky walls in shades of amber and crimson that seemed almost beautiful if not for the deadly purpose of their mission. Webb had been doing this for 8 years: recon missions, intelligence gathering, extraction operations. But something felt different today. His gut twisted with an instinct honed by hard experience and the narrow margins between survival and death. He'd learned to trust that feeling years ago, after watching soldiers ignore their intuition in favor of mission objectives. Those soldiers were in Arlington Cemetery now. "Stay tight," he whispered into his radio, watching his 3 soldiers move like ghosts between the boulders, their camouflage blending seamlessly with the desert landscape. The team had been assigned specific roles and positions, and they executed them with the synchronized precision that only comes from months of training and deployment together. Private First Class James Chen came next, moving low and swift, his M4 carbine held at the ready, his young face intense with concentration. Chen was only 23 on his second deployment, but he had the steady hands and calm nerves of someone twice his age. Behind him moved Corporal Derek Martinez, the team's heavy weapons specialist, carrying the M249 saw with the kind of familiarity that suggested they were old friends. Martinez had been in the military for 6 years and had the scars, both visible and invisible, to show for it. Last came Staff Sergeant Tom Holloway, the combat medic, whose pack was loaded with supplies and equipment that had already saved lives on previous operations. They'd been in-country for 6 months, and their synchronization was flawless. These men moved together like a single organism, each aware of the other's positions and intentions without needing to speak. They trained at Fort Bragg for 3 months before deployment, running scenario after scenario until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. When the moment came, and Webb always knew the moment would come, their bodies would react faster than their minds could process. That was the theory anyway. That was what the training manuals and the drill sergeants had promised. The mission briefing that morning had been straightforward. Intelligence reports suggested a Taliban supply cache hidden somewhere in the Zargun Canyon system. The cache contained weapons, explosives, and communication equipment that could be used to coordinate attacks on forward operating base Jalalabad. Slate 12's job was simple: locate the cache, assess its contents, and call for the heavy hitters to come destroy it. A day trip, an easy mission. The kind of assignment that made soldiers think they might actually make it home to their families. The kind of assignment that killed soldiers who let their guard down. Webb had been uneasy about the briefing from the moment the intelligence officer started speaking. Something about the location of the cache, something about how it had been discovered, something about the timing. It all felt too convenient. In his experience, enemy caches weren't discovered through electronic surveillance or human intelligence. They were discovered by accident when patrols got lucky, or they were discovered because someone wanted them to be found. That thought had nagged at him throughout the pre-mission briefing and through the hours of waiting before insertion. But he'd kept quiet. You didn't get a reputation as a careful, conservative officer by questioning intelligence reports. You got a reputation as someone paranoid and indecisive. Now, with the canyon floor opening up before them and the walls rising on either side like the jaws of some ancient beast, Webb's uneasiness had crystallized into something closer to dread. The shadows between the rocks seemed to hold more than just darkness. The silence had a quality to it that suggested presence rather than absence, the kind of silence that comes right before violence erupts. Webb had learned to recognize that silence. It was the silence before the storm. It was the silence of predators holding their breath before the strike. "Chen, take point on the left flank," Webb whispered into his radio. "Martinez, right side. Holloway, you're with me in the middle. Watch the ridgelines, watch everything." His voice was calm, measured, giving no indication of the certainty building in his gut that they were walking into something very wrong. The canyon walls seemed to lean inward, creating a natural corridor that led deeper into the mountains. It was perfect terrain for an ambush. Elevated positions that provided clear sight lines. Narrow enough to funnel movement. Enough rocks to provide cover for the attackers while leaving the valley floor exposed. They moved deeper step by careful step, 50 meters, 100 meters. The light was fading faster now as the sun dropped below the canyon rim, and shadows were spreading across the terrain like spilled ink. Webb could see Chen checking corners, could see Martinez scanning the upper ridgelines, could feel Holloway's presence behind him, steady and alert. They were good soldiers. They were well-trained and experienced and alert. But none of that mattered when you were about to be crushed by an avalanche. Preparation didn't change the outcome. Webb was about to call for a halt when his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, but his conscious mind hadn't yet accepted. The faint glint of reflected sunlight off a rifle scope on the ridgeline to the east. Just a flash, barely perceptible, but to a soldier who'd learned to see what others missed, it was a flashing neon sign reading death. "Contact," Webb screamed, but even as the word was leaving his mouth, the canyon erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the ridgelines like hellish fireworks, a constellation of death from every direction. The gunfire came from at least 3 positions. He could identify the different rates of fire, the different weapon signatures, and it was coordinated with devastating precision. Bullets whined and ricocheted off stone, kicking up dust clouds that choked the air and made vision almost impossible. Some rounds went high, some went low, but many found flesh. Chen screamed as a burst of fire caught him across the shoulders, spinning him around. But his training took over, and he dove toward the nearest boulder cluster, returning fire even as blood darkened his uniform. Martinez was already moving, laying down suppressive fire with his saw, the weapon's distinctive rattle cutting through the chaos like a chainsaw through wood. Holloway grabbed Webb's arm and pulled him toward cover, and they hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from Webb's lungs. For a moment, all was noise and confusion and the overwhelming reality that they were not going to complete this mission. They were going to fight for their lives. Webb's training kicked in immediately, overriding the shock, the fear, the sudden understanding that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. "Return fire! Return fire!" he screamed, positioning himself behind the largest boulder, his own M4 coming up to his shoulder. He could see muzzle flashes now, could count positions, 4, maybe 5 separate shooting positions ringing the valley. They were pinned down with no cover except the rocks they'd managed to reach. Escape routes were cut off in every direction. Altitude advantage belonged entirely to the enemy. And their ammunition was limited. Each soldier carried maybe 3 magazines, 90 rounds of 5.56 NATO, against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited fire. "Report," Webb shouted into his radio. "Holloway, Chen, Martinez, status." The responses came back in quick succession, each soldier confirming they were alive, accounted for, and still able to fight. Holloway had minor shrapnel wounds to his arm. Chen's injury was more serious. A ricochet had caught him across the upper shoulder, but the round had missed any vital structures. Martinez was uninjured, and Webb himself had somehow emerged from the initial barrage without a scratch. But they were trapped, absolutely, inescapably trapped. Webb realized with cold certainty that their mission had been compromised. This wasn't a chance encounter with a patrol. This was an ambush, a carefully planned military operation designed to kill them. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had set this trap and waited for them to walk into it. That realization, more than anything else, terrified him, because it meant the enemy wasn't reacting. The enemy had planned for their arrival, and if the enemy had planned for them, then they also planned for any attempt at rescue. Slate 12 wasn't going to stumble out of this canyon if they were lucky. Slate 12 was going to have to fight their way out, or they were going to die trying. Webb looked at his watch. Sunset was in approximately 20 minutes. After that, friendly forces would be limited in their ability to provide air support, and they were still 4 kilometers from any help, pinned down by enemy fire with dwindling ammunition and increasing darkness. "Hold positions," Webb commanded, his voice steady even as his mind raced through scenarios. "We hold until we can contact friendlies. We hold and we fight and we don't give up. Understood?" Three voices came back through his radio. "Understood, Sergeant." They settled into their defensive positions, these 4 American soldiers, and prepared for what they all believed would be the worst night of their lives. The radio handset felt impossibly heavy in Private First Class James Chen's trembling hands as another burst of enemy fire tore through the space where he'd been standing just seconds before. He dived behind a jagged boulder formation, his communications equipment miraculously intact despite the violence erupting around him. His shoulder throbbed where shrapnel from an earlier round had caught him, but the pain was secondary now, secondary to the desperate need to make someone understand that his team was dying. Any station, this is Slate 12 Actual," Chen screamed into the handset, his voice cracking despite every effort to maintain military composure. The protocols demanded calm, professional communications even in the face of apocalypse, but protocols were written by people who'd never felt rounds snapping past their head like angry wasps. "We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Repeat, we are in contact with at least 4 to 5 enemy positions. Elevation advantage is theirs. We are pinned down and unable to maneuver. Request immediate air support and close air support assets. This is priority emergency traffic." His words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other as more gunfire erupted around him. The radio crackled with static, and for a heart-stopping moment, Chen thought the transmission hadn't gotten through. Then a calm female voice responded, belonging to Captain Sarah Martinez in the Air Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Jalalabad, 15 kilometers away. "Slate 12, this is Command Center. Roger your transmission. Stand by for available assets." The voice was steady, professional, practiced, the voice of someone trained to deliver bad news without flinching. Chen had heard that tone before. It always preceded disappointment. Behind Chen's position, Sergeant Webb was doing quick mental calculations that made his stomach drop. They had arrived in this canyon at 16:45 hours, 4:45 in the afternoon. Sunset in these mountains came fast, around 18:45 hours, 6:45 in the evening. That gave them exactly 2 hours of daylight, minus however much they'd already lost. 2 hours to either fight their way out or hope for rescue. 2 hours until night fell and friendly air support became nearly impossible. Webb was returning fire methodically, his years of training overriding the panic that wanted to claw its way up his throat. Each shot was calculated, aimed at maintaining suppressive fire to keep the enemy's heads down. But the mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. He had 3 magazines, 90 rounds, and the enemy seemed to have infinite ammunition. At the rate they were exchanging fire, his ammunition would last maybe 20 minutes, if that. After that, they'd be reduced to throwing rocks. "Command Center, Slate 12, Chen transmitted again, his voice steadier now, his training reasserting itself. "What assets do you have available? We need something now. We need gunships, we need fast movers, we need anything you can throw at us right now." The pause that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. In reality, it was probably only 5 seconds, but in combat, 5 seconds is enough time for a man to die, for a position to be overrun, for everything to fall apart. When Captain Martinez's voice came back, it carried the weight of terrible news. "Slate 12, I'm checking available air assets now. Predator is on station but unarmed. Attack helicopters are currently engaged supporting operations in the Konar Valley, approximately 40 minutes out minimum. F-16s are engaged in a fire support mission for a convoy action 30 kilometers north, at least an hour away. We're checking what else is available, but initial status is not good. Stand by." Not good. Those were the words that turned Chen's blood to ice. Not good meant that the mission planners had miscalculated. Not good meant that the assurances they'd been given before leaving, that air assets would be available for immediate support if needed, were hollow. Not good meant that Slate 12 had walked into an ambush and the command structure had nothing immediately available to throw at the problem. Across the canyon, Corporal Derek Martinez heard Chen's transmissions over the team net and felt despair wrap around his chest like a physical weight. He was on his third deployment, and he'd learned that the worst part of combat wasn't always the shooting. It was the waiting, the uncertainty, the realization that your life depended on decisions made by people miles away in climate-controlled command centers. Martinez had the saw locked on a muzzle flash on the eastern ridgeline, and he was laying down suppressive fire, trying to keep the enemy's ability to concentrate their fire diminished. But he knew, with the grim certainty of experience, that suppressive fire was a temporary solution. Suppressive fire was buying time, and time was a currency they didn't have in abundance. Staff Sergeant Tom Holloway, the medic, was maintaining his own position while also keeping an eye on Chen, whose shoulder wound was bleeding more than he was admitting. Holloway had gone through combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, and he'd treated everything from heat exhaustion to traumatic amputation in the field. But the wound Chen had sustained was manageable. The real problem was what it represented. It meant the enemy's fire was finding its mark. It meant luck was running out. Slate 12, Command Center, Captain Martinez transmitted again. Okay, we have a Chinook that was staged at Forward Operating Base Sharon. It's approximately 35 minutes out from your position. We're working to get you air assets, but realistically we're looking at 30 to 45 minutes minimum for anything with teeth. Your best option is to fortify your position and prepare for extraction once we can get the hello in. Can you hold that long? Webb heard the transmission and felt the responsibility of command settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. Can you hold that long? The question was both reasonable and impossible. 30 to 45 minutes in a firefight was a long time. 30 to 45 minutes with limited ammunition was an eternity. 30 to 45 minutes when your enemy had superior positioning and seemed to have unlimited firepower was a death sentence. But the alternative, saying no, we can't hold, please send help before we're ready, wasn't an option either. Command Center, Slate 12, Webb transmitted, his voice steady despite the chaos. Affirmative, we'll hold. Just get me that hello and get me some air support when it's available. We didn't come this far to not make it home. It was a lie, really. A good soldier's lie. A lie designed to reassure the command structure that everything was under control, that Slate 12 wasn't about to be completely overrun. The truth was that Webb had no idea if they could hold. He had no way of knowing if the enemy would attempt to overrun their position before help arrived, or if they would maintain their current positions and just bleed Slate 12 dry through sustained fire. He had no way of knowing if his soldiers would hold their nerve, or if fear would eventually overwhelm training. Behind his position, Holloway had moved to check on Chen's shoulder more carefully, temporarily abandoning his defensive position. The wound was worse than Chen had indicated, a deep furrow across the upper deltoid that was bleeding steadily. I'm fine, Chen insisted, even as Holloway was applying a combat dressing with the efficient motions of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. I can still operate the radio. You'll operate the radio sitting down, Holloway said, already pulling out a field dressing. And you're going to let this medication work while I make sure you don't bleed to death. The casualty report went back to Webb almost immediately. Chen wounded but mobile, expected to be fully functional, no need for immediate medevac. It was the kind of assessment that sounded good on paper, but felt hollow in the context of being pinned down in a canyon with no immediate support. Webb looked at his ammunition supply and began doing the calculation he'd been avoiding. At current engagement rates, maybe, just maybe, they had enough ammunition to hold off the enemy for 30 minutes. After that, they'd have to switch to conservation, or they'd have to attempt to maneuver out of their current positions. Neither option was particularly appealing when the enemy held all the high ground. A new burst of fire came from the northern ridgeline, and Webb felt a round pass so close to his head that he could swear he heard it singing. He returned fire immediately, placing 3 quick shots at the muzzle flash, and was gratified to see the enemy position go silent. 35 to 45 minutes, he said quietly to himself, watching the sun continue its inexorable descent toward the western horizon. We just have to hold for 35 to 45 minutes. It seemed like both an eternity and an impossible task. Captain Ryan Ghost Morrison was lying on a bunk in the pilot's quarters at Forward Operating Base Jalalabad, staring at the water-stained ceiling when his world changed. His mind had been somewhere else, back in Colorado Springs with his wife Alina, who'd sent him an email that morning saying their daughter had made the soccer team. He'd read the message 3 times, imagining little Sarah in her uniform, imagining the games he'd miss while flying combat sorties over Afghanistan. That's where he was, mentally, when the alarm klaxon screamed to life, tearing him away from thoughts of home and responsibility and shattering his moment of peace. The alarm meant scramble. The alarm meant someone needed air support right now. The alarm meant that whatever Ghost had been thinking about, home, family, the normal world beyond the wire, could wait. In the hierarchy of military necessity, a scramble alert was the most important thing in the universe. Ghost's bare feet hit the floor running before his conscious mind had fully processed what his training recognized immediately. 8 years of active duty and 3 previous combat tours had hardwired the response into his nervous system. He was already moving toward his gear locker, already running through his mental checklist, already shifting into the hyper-focused state that had kept him alive through 300 sorties and counting. His roommate, another A-10 pilot named Captain Sledge Henderson, was already up and pulling on his flight suit. "You got the call?" Sledge asked, his voice already taking on the calm, focused tone that came before combat operations. "Not yet, but I'm headed out," Ghost replied, his hands moving through the familiar ritual of getting into his flight suit with practiced efficiency. The motion was automatic muscle memory driving every action. Zippers, Velcro, boots laced tight. These small actions were part of a sequence that had been drilled into him over thousands of hours, and he performed them without conscious thought. As he sprinted toward the flight line, the junior pilot on duty, Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb, no relation to Sergeant Webb down in the canyon, called out the situation briefing, having to run alongside Ghost to keep up with his pace. "Ambush team in the Zargun Canyon. 4 souls pinned down, heavy enemy fire. Team is calling it Slate 12. No immediate air assets available in their sector." Ghost's jaw tightened as the information registered. Zargun Canyon. That was outside their assigned operational area, at least 20 kilometers beyond the normal boundaries of the Forward Air Controller's area of operations. It was also at the edge of his fuel range, depending on how fast he flew and how long he had to loiter overhead. Under normal circumstances, the decision would be made for him. The mission wasn't his responsibility. The fuel equation was too tight. The authorization protocols hadn't been followed. Under normal circumstances, Ghost would stand down and wait for another assignment. But Ghost had learned long ago that combat rarely occurred under normal circumstances. His crew chief, Sergeant Hammer Henderson, had already started the pre-flight sequence when Ghost reached the aircraft. The A-10 Warthog sat on the tarmac like a predatory bird, its blunt nose and twin-tail booms giving it an aggressive appearance that matched its reputation. The aircraft had been built to kill tanks and destroy enemy positions, and it was damn good at what it did. More importantly, for Ghost's purposes right now, it was fast and tough and could carry more ordnance than any other aircraft on the base. "How's our fuel status?" Ghost asked, not bothering with the normal courtesies. When a scramble was happening, efficiency overrode protocol. "Full tanks," Hammer said without hesitation, wiping his hands on a grease rag. The crew chief knew what Ghost was thinking. They could see it in his face. "And I'm guessing you're not going to wait for official tasking on this one." Ghost didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Pre-flight status. Aircraft is fully combat loaded and ready to go. All systems green. She's hungry for a mission, Captain." Ghost nodded, running his eyes over the aircraft one more time. The Warthog was in perfect condition. He could see that even without the detailed pre-flight. The ordnance was loaded, 2,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and 2 pods of 2.75-inch rockets. Enough firepower to level a small city, or enough to keep 4 soldiers alive when they were surrounded by people who wanted them dead. The decision crystallized in Ghost's mind like ice forming on a winter pond. He'd been in combat long enough to know that hesitation in situations like this wasn't caution, it was negligence. Somewhere right now, 4 American soldiers were probably thinking about their families, probably wondering if this was where it ended. And there was an aircraft that could help them, and a pilot with the fuel and the weapons to make a difference. Everything else, authorization protocols, operational boundaries, fuel calculations, was secondary to that fundamental equation. Ghost had been flying long enough to understand that some rules existed to be broken by men who understood exactly what rule they were breaking and why. He'd learned that lesson from his mentor, Colonel Jack Viper Patterson, who taught him that the highest loyalty wasn't to the chain of command or to regulations. It was to the soldiers who were counting on you to come home alive. "Start the engines," Ghost commanded, and Hammer moved to execute the order without question. The crew chief had been with Ghost for 2 years and had learned to read the captain's intentions with the accuracy of a mind reader. If Ghost said launch, Hammer would launch. Ghost climbed the boarding ladder with practiced ease, each step bringing him closer to the cockpit and further from doubt. The wind was picking up slightly, carrying the smell of diesel fuel and the distant sound of small arms fire from the training range. By the time he reached the cockpit, the engines were already turning over, the massive turbofans beginning their familiar song. He settled into the ejection seat with the comfort of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The seat fit his body like a custom suit, and the controls were positioned exactly where his muscle memory expected them to be. His hands began the pre-flight sequence, checking instruments, verifying systems, running through the mental checklist that would determine whether the aircraft and pilot came home at the end of the mission. Behind him, Hammer was still on the radio, talking to the tower, trying to get official clearance for takeoff. But Ghost wasn't waiting for that conversation to conclude. His hands were already on the throttles, his eyes were scanning the instruments, and his mind was already in Zargun Canyon with Slate 12, calculating approach angles and firing patterns, and how to deliver maximum firepower with minimum risk to the soldiers on the ground. The tower was going to tell him no. The tower was going to say unauthorized, unauthorized, stand down and wait for proper tasking. Ghost knew this, accepted it, and decided in that moment that standing down wasn't an option. Standing down was the kind of decision that allowed good soldiers to die while their commander worried about protocols. "Slate 12, this is Ghost on station," Ghost transmitted on the radio, his voice calm and steady as if he'd been officially tasked all along. He didn't file a flight plan. He didn't notify the tower that he was departing. He simply pushed the throttles forward and felt the Warthog respond like a predator waking up hungry. The aircraft lifted off the runway with the smooth grace of something that weighed over 9 tons but seemed to float on air. Ghost pointed the nose southwest, toward the dying sun and the distant sound of gunfire that only his heightened senses could detect. Behind him, he heard the tower trying to call him back, heard the confusion in the controller's voice as a fully armed combat aircraft departed without authorization. Ghost didn't respond. His focus was already on the horizon, on the mathematics of fuel consumption and flight time, on the realization that he had somewhere between 2 and 3 hours of loiter time over Zargun Canyon before he'd be too low on fuel to safely return to base. It would have to be enough. He'd made a choice. Now he had to live with it or die with it. Either way, Slate 12 would have an overhead. That was all that mattered. The firefight had been ongoing for 8 minutes when the first sign of salvation arrived. It came as a sound, distinctive, unmistakable, and instantly recognizable to anyone who'd spent time around military aviation. It was the sound of twin turbofan engines pushing a massive aircraft to combat power, a roar that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. The noise reverberated off the canyon walls with such force that, for a moment, the enemy gunfire seemed to pause, as if the shooters were trying to process what was happening. Sergeant Marcus Webb heard it first, and for a moment, his trained military mind couldn't quite accept what his ears were telling him. No aircraft had been scheduled for their area. The last communications from Command Center had made that clear, 35 to 45 minutes minimum for any meaningful air support. And yet, there was no mistaking the sound of jet engines pushing hard through the thin mountain air. "Is that," Chen started to say, but Webb cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Get your head down," Webb commanded, not knowing whether the incoming aircraft was friendly or enemy, though his instincts screamed that no friendly aircraft should be in their sector. The possibility existed, however remote, that they were about to be strafed by someone who'd gotten bad intelligence about their location. The aircraft appeared over the eastern ridgeline like a predator dropping from the sky. The A-10 Warthog was not a graceful aircraft. Its brutish shape, twin booms, and blunt nose gave it the appearance of a flying shark with a serious attitude problem. To Sergeant Webb, watching it dive toward the canyon at what seemed like an impossible angle, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Ghost pushed the Warthog down to just over 50 feet of altitude, threading the aircraft between the canyon walls with the precision that came from years of low-level flying training. His hands were steady on the control stick, his mind compartmentalized into the focused state that separated good pilots from great ones. Below and ahead of him, he could see the American position, 4 distinct heat signatures visible on his thermal display, clustered near the largest rock formation in the valley floor. Around them, scattered across the ridgelines and elevated positions, he could see the enemy positions marked clearly on his tactical display. The math was simple and brutal. The enemy had numerical advantage. The enemy had positional advantage. The enemy had time on their side because, as darkness fell, American air support would become impossible. But the enemy did not have an A-10 with a pilot willing to bet his career on a rescue operation. "Slate 12, this is Ghost on station," he transmitted, his voice steady and calm despite the fact that he was about to commit an act of authorized violence against dozens of armed combatants. "I have visual on your position. Stand by for danger close. Keep your heads down and don't expose yourselves when I'm making my run." Webb heard the transmission and wanted to weep with relief. An actual combat pilot on station, armed and ready to help. The voice was calm, professional, authoritative, the voice of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly what he was doing. "Roger that, Ghost. We're pinned down on your west side near the large rock formation. Enemy has us from multiple ridgelines. We're ready for your fire support," Webb responded, his own voice taking on the clipped, professional tone of someone operating in their element. Ghost lined up his first pass before he was even fully through the canyon opening, his mind already calculating the geometry of the engagement. He had between 40 and 50 enemy combatants scattered across 5 primary firing positions. His approach vector would bring him in from the north, which would allow him to make a gun run on the largest concentration of enemy fighters, approximately 15 to 20 men dug in on the eastern ridgeline. He armed the GAU-8 Avenger cannon and felt the familiar weight of readiness settle over him. The gun was mounted in the nose of the aircraft, perfectly aligned with the fuselage. It was one of the most powerful weapon systems in the world, capable of firing 30 rounds per second of armor-piercing, incendiary rounds. In the hands of a pilot who knew what he was doing, it was a precision instrument of devastation. Ghost squeezed the trigger. The sound that erupted from the warthog's nose was unlike anything most people ever experienced in their lifetimes. It wasn't the rapid crackling of a rifle or even the distinctive buzz of a minigun. This was something deeper, more primal, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a grinding, tearing noise that vibrated the very air. The GAU-8 didn't sound like it was firing rounds. It sounded like it was ripping the sky apart. Below on the canyon floor, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The enemy position on the eastern ridgeline simply ceased to exist. Rounds the size of fire extinguishers, traveling at supersonic speed, tore through rock, flesh, and equipment with utterly indiscriminate violence. Muzzle flashes disappeared. Bodies and debris fountained into the air. The enemy fighters who'd been so confident in their superior positioning found themselves facing a predator they couldn't see, couldn't hide from, and couldn't escape. Corporal Martinez watched the ridgeline erupt into chaos and felt something like joy burst through his chest. After 8 minutes of feeling like a condemned man, suddenly the equation had changed. Now they had a gun in their corner. Now they had someone who could reach out and touch the people trying to kill them. "Holy shit," Martinez breathed, his voice carrying absolute wonder. "Did you see that, did you?" "Keep firing," Webb commanded, though his own voice carried a note of relief. "Maintain suppressive fire on the northern and western ridgelines." Ghost banked the Warthog hard, pulling up from his attack run and simultaneously rolling the aircraft to reverse direction for another pass. The G-forces pressed him into his seat, and his vision grayed slightly from the acceleration, but the sensation was familiar, almost welcome. This was what he was trained for. This was what the aircraft was built for. This was what he'd signed up to do with his life. As he completed his turn and lined up for another run, Ghost assessed the tactical situation with the speed of thought. The first pass had degraded enemy combat effectiveness by approximately 30 to 40%. The remaining positions were already showing signs of demoralization. Some positions were going quiet rather than continuing to suppress the American team. It was a classic response to overwhelming firepower. When you couldn't win, you stopped fighting. "Slate 12, Ghost is making my second run," he transmitted, already descending back into the canyon. "Target is the western ridgeline. Stay in your position and keep your heads down." The second pass was, if anything, more devastating than the first. Ghost had identified a secondary concentration of enemy fighters on the western ridge, and he brought the full weight of the Avenger to bear on them. The canyon filled with the sound of the gun again, that terrifying, magnificent roar that seemed to shake the very earth. Rocks exploded. Positions that had been pouring fire at Slate 12 simply disappeared, their occupants either dead, dying, or too shocked to continue fighting. On the canyon floor, Sergeant Webb watched the transformation with mounting realization. They weren't dying. Against every probability, against every calculation of how this should end, they were being saved. The aircraft overhead, this Ghost, was doing what a single human being with the right training, the right equipment, and the right attitude could accomplish. Staff Sergeant Holloway was looking at Webb with tears streaming down his face. "He came," Holloway said simply. "We're pinned down in the middle of nowhere and he came." The enemy fire was reducing now, not from lack of ammunition, but from loss of will. The primary kill weapons on the ridgelines had been destroyed or abandoned. The positions that had seemed so formidable 15 minutes earlier were collapsing under the onslaught of the A-10's guns. Ghost completed his second pass and began calculating his loiter time. He'd used approximately 20% of his fuel on these 2 strafing runs. He had enough left for maybe 3 or 4 more passes, plus enough reserve to get back to base if everything went perfectly. The question now became not, can I help them, but how long can I keep this up? As he banked around for another pass, Ghost heard a voice come through his headset, the voice of Slate 12's sergeant, and in that voice was the unmistakable tone of a man who'd been given a second chance at life. "Ghost, whatever you want when this is over, it's yours. You name it, you got it. We owe you our lives." Ghost didn't respond verbally. Instead, he simply pushed the throttles forward and pointed the nose of his aircraft at the remaining enemy positions, ready to maintain this cover as long as humanly possible. Words could wait. Right now, what mattered was making sure these 4 soldiers made it home. The canyon filled with the sound of thunder once again. Ghost completed his second strafing run and was already calculating his approach vector for the third pass when he noticed something on his tactical display that made his blood run cold. The scattered enemy positions were consolidating. What had been 5 distinct fighting positions was now becoming 3, which meant the survivors were grouping up, reorganizing and adapting their tactics. The enemy was learning. That was dangerous in ways that initial confusion and disorganization had prevented. He banked the Warthog hard, pulling up to gain altitude for the next attack. The aircraft responded sluggishly, not dramatically, but noticeably enough that Ghost's training flagged the issue immediately. His instruments showed everything in the green, but there was a subtle degradation in responsiveness that suggested something wasn't quite right. Combat damage, probably. A round through a control surface, maybe. Nothing catastrophic, but something that would need to be addressed once he got back to the base. Assuming he got back to the base. "Slate 12, Ghost is repositioning for another pass," he transmitted, rolling the aircraft into a steep dive that would bring him back down into the canyon from a different angle. The idea was to prevent the enemy from anticipating his approach vector. Adaptive enemies were dangerous, and Ghost knew he couldn't afford to become predictable. Predictable pilots got killed, and he had no intention of becoming a statistic. Below, on the canyon floor, Sergeant Webb was watching the ridgelines with grim intensity. The enemy fire had diminished significantly, maybe 60 or 70% reduction in volume compared to before Ghost's first pass. But it hadn't stopped entirely. There were still positions that were returning fire, still fighters who hadn't broken. Those were the dangerous ones. The ones who'd stay and fight to the end, who wouldn't surrender, who'd chosen a path that led to only one possible outcome. "Keep heads down," Webb commanded his team. "Ghost is coming in again, let him work." Ghost pushed the throttles forward, feeling the engines respond with the familiar surge of power that came from running military turbofans at combat power. The G-forces pressed him back into his seat as he descended into the canyon at an angle that would have made a normal pilot's mind rebel against the danger. But Ghost was not a normal pilot. Ghost was a man who'd spent thousands of hours training his body and mind to operate at the edge of human capability. His targeting system painted the consolidated enemy position on his heads-up display. About 15 to 20 fighters concentrated on the northern ridgeline, clearly preparing for an assault on the American position. They'd regrouped, reorganized, and were planning a final push, probably gambling that the American air support couldn't continue indefinitely. It was actually a sound tactical decision. It was just calculated against incomplete information. Ghost armed the cannon again and began his third run. The problem with concentrated enemy positions was that they tended to have better defensive weapons as well. Individuals scattered across multiple positions rarely had access to anything heavier than small arms and RPGs. But a consolidated position, one where commanders had gathered their remaining forces, often had more serious anti-aircraft capabilities. This was something Ghost understood intellectually, but had underestimated emotionally. The desire to finish the job, to completely eliminate the threat to Slate 12, had made him more aggressive than strict tactical prudence might have dictated. At 300 meters altitude, descending fast, with his attention focused on the gun run, Ghost's peripheral vision caught a flash of light that made his training system scream a warning. Something had launched from the northern position. Something large. Something moving fast. An RPG. Time seemed to compress into something more manageable. Ghost's brain processed the information in microseconds: trajectory, velocity, intercept point. The missile was perfectly aimed, predicted to reach a collision point with his aircraft in approximately 3 seconds. Under normal circumstances, 3 seconds was an eternity. In combat, 3 seconds was barely enough time to register that you were in trouble. Ghost reacted by instinct and 8 years of training combined. He snap-rolled the Warthog to the left, a violent maneuver that threw the aircraft sideways with a force that brought the G-meter into double figures. His vision grayed at the edges from the sudden acceleration. His internal organs seemed to protest the violence of the movement, but the maneuver worked exactly as intended. The RPG flashed past his canopy, so close that Ghost could feel the shock wave of its passage through the fuselage. The missile missed by perhaps 10 meters, close enough to send a thermal bloom across his windscreen, close enough that he could swear he felt the heat through the armored glass. The projectile screamed on past his aircraft and exploded against a distant mountainside, the detonation creating a small mushroom of smoke and dust. But the RPG's near miss had taken a toll. Ghost's instruments lit up like a Christmas tree at a party for electricians. Multiple warning lights screamed for his attention. The heads-up display was showing hydraulic pressure fluctuations. The flight control system was reporting degraded responsiveness. And most critically, his fuel management system was showing something that made his stomach drop into a territory previously unknown to human physiology. A fuel leak. Not massive, not immediately catastrophic, but significant enough that his calculations about loiter time had just become significantly more pessimistic. Ghost ran the numbers in his head with the speed of trained muscle memory. He'd had enough fuel for perhaps 3 more passes and a return to base. Now, with a fuel leak reducing his available reserves, he was looking at maybe 2 more passes before he'd need to start the journey back. And that assumed the leak didn't get worse. "Slate 12, Ghost," he transmitted, his voice giving away absolutely nothing of the jeopardy he'd just experienced. "Enemy is consolidating and still engaging. I'm going to hammer them again, then we need to start thinking about your extraction." He didn't mention the near miss. He didn't mention the fuel leak. He didn't mention the realization that was crystallizing in his mind. He might not make it back to base. But what he would do, was ensure that Slate 12 made it to extraction. Webb heard the transmission and understood its implications. 2 more passes. That meant roughly 10 more minutes of air cover. After that, they'd be relying on the Chinook and their own ability to maintain suppressive fire. It wasn't much, but it was better than they'd had this morning. "How much longer?" Chen asked over the radio, his shoulder wound now properly dressed and bandaged, his voice steady despite the pain. "As long as it takes," Webb replied, not really answering the question but answering the fear behind it. Ghost completed his second approach and rolled in for his 4th strafing run. He was flying the aircraft differently now, more deliberately, more carefully, trying to conserve fuel while still delivering the maximum amount of firepower necessary to keep the enemy suppressed. The cannon roared again, and the enemy position on the northern ridgeline erupted into another paroxysm of violence and destruction. This time the response was more muted. The surviving fighters were running now. Ghost could see them on his thermal display, fleeing down the reverse slope of the ridgeline, abandoning their position. The assault had been broken. The consolidation had failed. As he climbed out of his 4th pass, Ghost's fuel gauge showed exactly how bad the situation had become. He had enough for 1 more short pass, a very short pass, before he'd need to point the nose toward the base and trust that his fuel wouldn't run out somewhere over the desert with no landing options in sight. "Slate 12, Ghost," he transmitted, and this time he did allow a thread of urgency into his voice. "I'm going to make 1 more run to make sure those consolidators don't reform. After that, I need to start RTB, return to base. But the Chinook is inbound and will be here in approximately 15 minutes. You can make that work." Webb swallowed hard, looking at his team, assessing their condition and morale. They were exhausted, wounded, running low on ammunition, but they were still fighting. They were still alive. And in another 15 minutes, they'd have the Chinook inbound. Roger that, Ghost. We can hold for 15 minutes. Thank you for coming. Hold the line, Ghost replied simply. I'll be back if you need me. It was a lie, and he knew it. He wouldn't be back. His fuel situation wouldn't allow it. But Slate 12 didn't need to know that. Slate 12 needed to believe that help was coming, that the impossible had been made possible, that 4 soldiers in a canyon had been given a second chance at life by the arrival of 1 man and 1 aircraft. Ghost pushed the throttles forward for the final pass, knowing that every second of flight time he used now was a second he wouldn't have for the journey home. The Warthog descended into the canyon one last time, its guns ready for one final moment of violence, its pilot ready to dance with death one more time if it meant keeping his promise to the soldiers below. The Chinook appeared on the southern horizon like a mechanical angel descending through the crimson sky, its twin rotors churning the air into a maelstrom that could be seen from kilometers away. The sight of that aircraft was simultaneously the most beautiful and most dangerous moment of Slate 12's entire operation. Beautiful because it represented extraction, escape, survival. Dangerous because extraction was the moment when soldiers were most vulnerable, when they had to leave defensive positions and cross open ground, exposed to enemy fire, with nowhere to hide except forward momentum. Corporal Derek Martinez spotted it first, his eyes picking up the distinctive silhouette before anyone else could see the aircraft. Transport inbound. I got visual on the Chinook. He screamed into his radio, his voice cracking with a mixture of relief and urgency. This is it. This is our window. The helicopter began its descent into the small clearing that had been designated as the landing zone, a space roughly 100 meters from Slate 12's defensive position, surrounded by rock formations that provided some concealment, but would also limit the Chinook's ability to maneuver once it was on the ground. The landing zone was far from ideal, but it was the best available option, and helicopters landing in hot zones didn't have the luxury of being picky about terrain. Ghost saw the Chinook beginning its descent and immediately understood what needed to happen. The helicopter was vulnerable on its way down. The helicopter was vulnerable while it was loading. The helicopter was vulnerable during its takeoff. In fact, extraction operations were almost entirely vulnerable. They were also absolutely necessary. He keyed his radio to the Chinook pilot. Slinger 6, this is Ghost. I'm going to lay down suppressive fire on the enemy positions to cover your insertion. Keep your door gunners ready. I'll mark the hot zones with my runs. Ghost, Slinger 6, the Chinook pilot, Captain Michael Torres, responded. His voice was calm, professional, a man who'd done extractions under fire before. We're coming down in the LZ. Stand by for our approach. The Chinook descended lower, its massive rotors creating a wind that kicked up dust and debris across the canyon floor. Ghost didn't waste any time. He pulled the Warthog into a hard banking turn, lining up his approach vector on the nearest enemy position that still showed signs of active resistance. His fuel gauge was showing numbers that made his jaw clench. He was burning through his reserves faster than he'd calculated, the leak making his fuel situation increasingly critical. But Slate 12 was about to move. Everything else was secondary. Slate 12 actual, Ghost is engaging enemy positions. You have maybe 30 seconds before that Chinook is wheels down. Start moving to the LZ on my mark. And keep low, stay behind whatever cover you can find. Sergeant Webb heard the transmission and made the decision that every leader dreads, ordering people he cared about to run toward a helicopter under enemy fire. It was necessary. It was tactically sound. But it was terrifying because he knew, with absolute certainty, that not everyone might make it. Slate 12 moved to the LZ, Webb commanded, gesturing sharply at his soldiers. Chen, Martinez, Holloway, go, go, go. They moved, Years of training, muscle memory, and the primal drive for survival pushed them out of their defensive positions. Private Chen moved first, limping slightly from his shoulder wound but maintaining a good pace, his rifle held across his body. His young face was set in determination, his eyes locked on the landing Chinook. Behind him came Corporal Martinez, the squad's heavy weapons specialist, providing rear cover fire even as he ran, his saw sweeping across the ridgelines looking for targets of opportunity. Staff Sergeant Holloway, the medic, was moving in bounds, short rushes forward followed by stops to assess the situation. His decades of combat experience showed in every movement, economical and purposeful. Ghost unleashed the GAU-8 on the northwestern ridgeline, the cannon's roar once again filling the canyon with its distinctive sound of controlled violence. This time, the shots were carefully placed to suppress rather than to destroy. He needed to keep enemy heads down without wasting ammunition on a gun run that was purely suppressive. The rounds impacted and exploded, sending rock shards and dust fountaining upward, creating a visual screen that made enemy fire less accurate. The Chinook's ramp was already lowering even as it descended the final meter toward the ground. Two crew members in Army flight suits were already visible in the open bay, their faces visible even through the dust and chaos. One was carrying an M249 saw, ready to provide suppressive fire from the open ramp. Chen reached the Chinook first, his boots hitting the ramp at a full run. A crew member grabbed his arm and hauled him forward into the bay with practiced urgency. Chen stumbled, nearly fell, but hands from the crew were already helping him up, already moving him toward the interior to make room for the next soldier. Martinez was right behind Chen, his saw still firing even as he approached the aircraft. The moment his feet hit the ramp, he turned and continued providing fire toward the ridgelines, his weapon barking out measured bursts to keep the enemy suppressed. The crew member didn't try to pull him inside. They knew his job was to provide cover fire until the bird was loaded. Holloway was moving more carefully now, his medic training making him aware of the pain in his own body that he'd been ignoring. He reached the ramp and basically threw himself forward, his medical pack nearly catching on the edge. He scrambled inside, immediately turning to look back at the canyon floor where Sergeant Webb was still in position. Because Sergeant Webb, the leader, had made the decision that leaders always make when things get desperate. He was going to be last off the position, last in the helicopter, last to safety. It was the oldest military tradition, and it was why good soldiers followed their leaders, because those leaders didn't ask them to do anything they weren't willing to do themselves. "Ghost, this is Slate 12 Actual. I'm moving now," Webb transmitted, his voice steady despite the fact that he was about to cross 100 meters of open ground under enemy fire. 3 soldiers are aboard, 1 to go. "Roger that," Ghost replied, already lining up another approach vector. "I got you covered. Go, go, go." Webb came out of his position at a dead run, his rifle in one hand, his radio in the other. The distance seemed impossibly long, an eternity of exposure. His legs burned with adrenaline and fatigue. His lungs screamed for air. Behind him, the canyon walls echoed with enemy gunfire, and he could hear rounds snapping past, too close for comfort. Ghost made his final pass, and this one was pure suppression. He brought the Warthog down to an altitude that made even seasoned pilots nervous, threading between the canyon walls at a speed that seemed physically impossible. The cannon roared, and entire sections of the ridgeline simply disappeared under the onslaught of 30 fire. Bodies and equipment fountained into the air. The earth itself seemed to shake from the violence of it. Webb was 30 meters from the Chinook now, his legs pumping, his breath coming in gasps. The helicopter's door gunner was laying down his own fire now, the M240 machine gun adding its distinctive rattle to the symphony of violence. The pilot was watching the LZ carefully, keeping the bird stable, knowing that his aircraft was about to leave the ground with or without Sergeant Webb. 20 meters. Webb could see the interior of the Chinook now, could see his soldiers' faces looking back at him. Chen was trying to reach out, ready to grab his sergeant and pull him aboard. Martinez was covering with his saw, his jaw clenched in concentration. Holloway was standing, ready to provide medical attention if needed. 10 meters. Webb was going to make it. The distance was collapsing, the goal was getting closer, and a burst of enemy fire came from a position Ghost hadn't completely suppressed. Rounds kicked up dust at Webb's heels, missing his legs by perhaps a foot. Ghost saw the muzzle flash and immediately banked the Warthog, his damaged aircraft responding sluggishly but responding nonetheless. He lined up on that position and squeezed the trigger one final time, knowing that this burst was probably going to be the difference between Webb living and Webb becoming another name on a memorial wall. The enemy position disappeared. Webb hit the ramp of the Chinook at full speed, his momentum carrying him forward into the bay where Chen and Martinez were already reaching for him, already pulling him inside, already getting him to safety. Webb scrambled forward, collapsing against the interior wall, his chest heaving, his mind temporarily incapable of processing anything except the profound relief that he was still alive. "Ramp up! Ramp up!" Pilot Torres commanded, seeing that all 4 soldiers were aboard. The hydraulics whined and the ramp began its ascent. Torres was already pulling the collective, and the massive Chinook began to rise from the landing zone, its rotors working hard against the thin mountain air. Ghost watched the helicopter climb and felt the weight of his responsibility shift slightly. They were getting out. They were going to make it. He made one more pass, not to fire but to escort, to provide a visible presence of protection as the Chinook climbed towards safer altitudes and friendlier territory. "Slinger 6, Ghost, you're clear. Nice work down there." "Ghost, Slinger 6, Torres replied, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. "Thank you. Those soldiers owe you their lives." Ghost didn't respond. He was too busy running calculations on his fuel status, trying to figure out exactly how close to empty he was going to be when his wheels touched down at the base. The answer wasn't comforting. But Slate 12 was safe. That was all that mattered. The sun was touching the western horizon as Ghost turned the A-10 Warthog away from the Chinook, pointing the nose toward forward operating base Jalalabad, and what he sincerely hoped would be his eventual landing. His instruments were painting a picture of his situation that ranged from concerning to absolutely terrifying, depending on which gauges he was looking at and which calculations he was running through his head. The fuel leak was worse than his initial assessment had suggested. His fuel quantity indicator was dropping at a rate that defied the laws of physics and mercy combined. Ghost ran the numbers one more time, his pilot's mind performing calculations that had become second nature through years of training and operational flying. He had approximately 50 kilometers to cover to reach the base. At his current fuel consumption rate and current altitude, he had enough fuel to cover maybe 55 kilometers. In theory, that meant he could make it. In practice, theory was written by people who'd never actually flown a damaged aircraft with a fuel leak across the desert. "Forward operating base Jalalabad, this is Ghost inbound," he transmitted, his voice steady and professional despite the fact that his heart was pounding against his ribs like a caged animal. "I've got Slate 12 escort en route to your position. I'm on fumes and I've got battle damage to report. Recommend you start the emergency equipment standby procedures." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before the response came from the tower controller. "Ghost, Jalalabad Tower, copy that. We have emergency services standing by. Request you report fuel status and nature of battle damage." Ghost glanced at his fuel quantity gauge. The needle was pointing at a number that made him want to laugh or cry. He wasn't sure which emotion was more appropriate. "Jalalabad, I've got approximately 1,800 pounds of fuel remaining. That's just under 900 kilograms. I've got a hydraulic leak from battle damage, possible fuselage penetrations, and control surface degradation. Aircraft is flyable but not at optimal efficiency." The tower controller didn't respond immediately, which told Ghost everything he needed to know about how dire his situation actually was. Experienced air traffic controllers didn't pause. They processed information and responded. A pause meant they were running calculations of their own, doing the math on whether the aircraft had enough fuel to reach the runway. The desert below was a mix of orange and purple as the sun continued its descent, painting the landscape in colors that would have been beautiful if Ghost wasn't so acutely aware that every minute of daylight loss meant less time for emergency procedures if something went wrong. The Warthog was maintaining an altitude of 3,000 feet, which was good for distance gliding if the engines failed, but bad for fuel consumption at this speed. Ghost made a command decision. He reduced power slightly, watching his airspeed decay from 400 knots to 380 knots. It was a marginal reduction, but it would buy him precious minutes of flight time. The problem was that the Warthog wasn't designed for fuel efficiency. It was designed for combat power and survivability. Flying it economically was like asking a bull to move gracefully through a china shop. Technically possible, but you were working against the fundamental nature of what the aircraft was. His engine temperature warning lights were flickering now, giving him little yellow cautions that meant the engines were working harder than designed to maintain even the reduced power setting. The aircraft was screaming at him through its instruments, telling him that every system was stressed, every component was operating at the edge of what it could tolerate. Ghost's mind was running 3 separate calculation streams simultaneously. One part of his consciousness was managing the aircraft, making minute adjustments to heading and altitude to optimize glide ratio if the engines quit. Another part was doing fuel mathematics, running scenarios and variations. The third part was dealing with the emotion of the situation, the realization that he'd made the choice to come to Slate 12's aid, knowing that it might cost him his own life. He thought about Alina, his wife. He thought about Sarah, his daughter, who'd made the soccer team. He thought about the email he hadn't had time to respond to because he'd been launching a combat mission. He thought about all the things he'd planned to do when he rotated home, all the promises he'd made about being more present, more engaged. Ghost pushed those thoughts away. They were distractions, and distractions got pilots killed. Right now, he needed to focus on the one problem that mattered, getting this aircraft on the ground at forward operating base Jalalabad before he ran out of fuel. The Chinook was visible on his tactical display, moving southwest toward the base at a faster pace than the Warthog. The helicopter would arrive maybe 10 minutes before him, which meant Slate 12 would already be safe and secure by the time Ghost was facing his most critical moment. That was good. That was right. The soldiers came first. Jalalabad Tower, fuel status is now at approximately 1,600 pounds, Ghost reported, watching the gauge continue its relentless decline. His voice remained professional, but he was acutely aware of every syllable, every breath. I'm on a direct course for your position, descending to 2,000 feet to reduce fuel burn, estimating landing in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes, 50 kilometers, 1,600 pounds of fuel. The math was getting tighter, the margin for error shrinking like a pool of water on a hot day. The Warthog's control surfaces were responding noticeably sluggish now, the hydraulic leak causing friction and resistance that required more pilot input to maintain smooth flight. Ghost's arms were beginning to feel the strain of fighting the aircraft, of making constant small correction to keep the nose pointed at the distant base and the wings level against the buffeting desert winds. He switched fuel pumps, trying to get better flow from different tank configurations. The move made a marginal improvement, but every little bit helped. His mind was cataloging every option, every possible means of conserving fuel or improving efficiency. 10 kilometers to the base. His fuel gauge was reading 1,200 pounds now. The ratio was no longer providing comfort. 1,200 pounds at current consumption rates meant he had maybe 9 minutes of flight time. He could see the base on the horizon now, its runway a dark line stretching across the desert like a lifeline. The tower controller called him again. "Ghost, Jalalabad, we have you on radar at 15 kilometers out. Recommend you begin descent to pattern altitude. Runway 08 is clear for emergency landing. Emergency services are in position and standing by." Ghost acknowledged the instruction and began a gentle descent, dropping the nose of the Warthog to angle toward the runway. The aircraft responded sluggishly, the hydraulic leak making every control input feel like he was working with the stiffness of an old machine. But it was responding. It was flying. It wasn't failing. Not yet, anyway. 8 kilometers. 8 minutes of fuel. The math was getting too tight. Ghost's training screamed at him that this was the moment when pilots started making mistakes, when the pressure of the situation overrode proper procedure. He forced himself to slow down, to breathe, to make every action deliberate and intentional. His engine temperature was climbing. One engine was showing a caution light that suggested it wasn't happy about the sustained power output combined with the damage it had sustained. But both engines were turning over, both were producing thrust, both were keeping the dying aircraft in the air. 5 kilometers, 5 minutes of fuel. The runway was getting visibly larger, the perspective changing as he descended. Ghost could see the emergency equipment now, the fire trucks with their lights flashing, the crash crew standing by, the medical personnel in position. The tower was clearing him to approach. 3 kilometers. The landing gear warning light came on as he prepared to lower the gear, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ghost wondered if the landing gear would deploy properly. A controlled crash without the gear would be survivable but not pleasant. The landing gear extended with a mechanical certainty that Ghost had never appreciated until that moment. 2 kilometers, 2 minutes of fuel. His fuel warning light was now a steady, ominous red instead of an amber caution. The engines were drinking fuel like they had a personal vendetta against survival. 1 kilometer. The runway was right there, a concrete lifeline stretching before him. Ghost could feel the aircraft's engine starting to labor, could feel the power output declining as fuel starvation began to affect combustion. His hands were steady on the stick, his eyes locked on the approach path. The Warthog crossed the runway threshold with roughly 500 pounds of fuel remaining in the tanks. Ghost was aware of this fact with the clarity of a man facing absolute certainty. He was going to land this aircraft, but there was no margin for error, no room for second chances. The main gear touched down with a gentle chirp of rubber on concrete. The nose gear followed a moment later. The aircraft was slowing, rolling down the runway, eating distance and burning what little fuel remained. Ghost kept the power at idle and let the aircraft coast, trusting in forward momentum and aerodynamics to carry him to a safe stop. The runway length was abundant, and the Warthog was burning fuel too fast to be terribly concerned about distance. His engines, both of them now running on fumes and prayer, continued to turn as the aircraft decelerated. 500 meters of runway remaining, 400, 300. The aircraft was slowing, its momentum decreasing as friction and gravity reasserted their dominance over thrust. 200 meters, 100. The Warthog rolled to a complete stop on the concrete runway with approximately 100 pounds of fuel remaining in the tanks. Not zero, not completely empty, but close enough that Ghost's hands were shaking as he killed the engines and sat in the sudden silence of a cockpit with no power. He'd made it, against odds that had been calculated as impossible, against a damaged aircraft and a fuel leak, and an emergency that had never quite become completely manageable. He'd made it home. The wheels of the A-10 Warthog touched down on the concrete runway at forward operating base Jalalabad with a precision that would have been impossible if Ghost had been thinking about it consciously. But conscious thought was a luxury he couldn't afford in those final moments. His mind was operating on instinct and training. The higher functions dedicated entirely to the mechanical task of landing a damaged aircraft with barely any fuel remaining. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Ghost sat motionless in the cockpit for a moment, his hand still gripping the stick, his breath coming in deep, shaking gasps. The engines wound down, their roar fading to a whimper and then to silence. The silence was profound, absolute, almost overwhelming after hours of the constant drone of combat operations and engine noise. He'd made it. Against every probability, against the mathematics that should have dictated his failure, he'd made it home. Ghost reached down with trembling hands and began the shutdown sequence, methodically working through the checklist that would secure the aircraft. Kill switches, fuel shutoffs, electrical systems. The familiar motions helped ground him, helped bring his racing heart back down from the elevated state it had been maintaining for the entire journey home. His hands were still shaking as he worked, adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical force now that the emergency was over. He was pulling off his flight helmet when the first crew member reached the aircraft. It was Hammer Henderson, his crew chief, running across the tarmac with a grin that split his weathered face. Behind him came a swarm of maintenance personnel and emergency responders, drawn by the sight of the damaged Warthog and the emergency status of the landing. Ghost climbed down the boarding ladder on rubber legs, feeling every one of the past 2 hours of combat stress settling into his muscles like lead. The ground felt strange beneath his boots, too solid, too stationary after hours of flight. He was barely halfway down the ladder when Hammer reached him, grabbed his flight suit, and pulled him into a crushing embrace that would have knocked over a normal man. "Jesus Christ, sir," Hammer breathed, not bothering to release him. "We thought you were going to run out of fuel over the desert. We were running the numbers and they all said you didn't have enough." "I didn't," Ghost replied, his voice hoarse from the combat radio frequency operations. "For about 10 kilometers there, I was flying on faith and fumes." Behind Hammer, the maintenance crew was already moving around the aircraft, documenting the damage visible even to the untrained eye. There were holes in the fuselage, multiple penetrations where enemy fire had found the aircraft. One hydraulic line was actively leaking, leaving a small puddle beneath the aircraft. The left wing had visible damage where a near-miss explosion had marked the aircraft. One of the tail booms had shrapnel scarring. This aircraft had been flying damaged and wounded for the better part of an hour, limping home on engines that should have been screaming for mercy. Ghost was still trying to process the reality of being on the ground when Captain Michael Torres, the Chinook pilot, approached him. Torres was grinning, his flight suit still damp with sweat, his face covered in the dust of a hot landing. Behind him walked Sergeant Marcus Webb, and immediately behind Webb came Chen, Martinez, and Holloway, the 4 members of Slate 12, alive and mobile and moving toward Ghost like men approaching a deity. Webb reached Ghost first and simply pulled him into an embrace that was half grateful hug, half collapse. The sergeant's shoulders shook as he gripped Ghost, and Ghost realized with a start that Webb was crying, not from weakness, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of survival. "You came back," Webb said, his voice breaking slightly. "When you said you were running low on fuel, I thought we were going to lose you, but you came back anyway." Ghost didn't know what to say. He'd made the decision in the moment, had calculated the risks and accepted them, had chosen to stay overhead rather than abandon Slate 12 to their fate. But putting that choice into words felt somehow diminishing, as if language couldn't capture the weight of what had happened in that canyon. The other soldiers moved in, each shaking Ghost's hand, some of them unable to speak, their jaws too tight with emotion. Chen, the young private with the shoulder wound, was openly weeping. Martinez kept repeating, thank you, sir," like a prayer. Holloway, the combat medic, did a quick assessment of Ghost's status, apparently deciding that the pilot was physically intact if emotionally overwhelmed. The base commander, Colonel James Richardson, appeared through the gathered crowd with the expression of a man who just received both his best and worst news of the day. On one hand, his soldiers were alive. On the other hand, a combat aircraft had just landed on his runway with damage that would require significant repair, and his air operations had just had an unauthorized launch by one of his captains. "Captain Morrison," Richardson said, his voice formal despite the informality of the situation. "In my office. Now, you too, Sergeant Webb, if you're able." The walk to the commander's office took them past the flight line where Ghost's A-10 sat being documented by the maintenance crew. Ghost saw the photographs being taken, the measurements being made, the damage assessments being recorded. He understood what was about to happen. This operation was going to be classified to the highest levels. The details would be buried in official reports. The names would be changed, the locations made vague, the timeline altered. The military had procedures for this kind of thing, methods for ensuring that the unauthorized actions of good soldiers didn't create institutional problems. Colonel Richardson's office was exactly what Ghost expected. Maps on the walls, photographs of previous operations, the accumulated weight of command visible in every line on the commander's face. Richardson gestured for Ghost and Webb to sit, then settled behind his desk with the air of a man preparing to deliver a difficult decision. "What you did today was unauthorized," Richardson began, his voice level and professional. "You launched outside your area of operations without proper tasking. You expended fuel you shouldn't have expended. You engaged enemy positions against the advice of established protocols. By the book, I should be writing you up for this, recommending your removal from flight status pending investigation." Ghost said nothing. He understood the position his commanding officer was in, caught between regulations and reality, between the letter of military law and the spirit of soldiers saving soldiers. "However," Richardson continued, "what you did today also saved 4 lives that would have been lost if you hadn't taken that action. I've received reports from Forward Air Control and from the Chinook pilot confirming that Slate 12 would not have survived until nightfall without your intervention. You made an impossible choice and saved lives." Richardson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where Ghost's damaged aircraft was being processed. "This operation is now classified. The mission details, the unauthorized launch, the fuel situation, all of it classified. Officially, you were tasked to support operations in Zargun Canyon and performed your duties with excellence. The aircraft damage was the result of normal combat operations." He turned back to face Ghost. "What you did today, Captain Morrison, exemplified the highest traditions of the Air Force, but you also broke significant regulations, and I need to know that you understand the consequences of that choice." Ghost met the colonel's eyes. "Sir, I understand. I'd make the same choice again." Richardson nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something he'd suspected. "I know you would. That's both your greatest strength and the reason why you're going to have a target on your back if this ever becomes public. For now, though, it won't. What happens in that canyon stays in that canyon." After the meeting, Ghost found himself back on the flight line, watching as his crew chief continued the damage assessment. Hammer walked over with a clipboard, his expression grim. "Sir, she's pretty torn up. Hydraulic damage, fuselage penetrations in 5 locations, damage to the left wing structure. Control surfaces are compromised. She's flyable, but she's going to be down for significant repairs, probably looking at 3 weeks minimum before she's back in combat status." Ghost nodded, running his hand across the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the jagged edges of shrapnel holes. "She got us home." "Yes, sir, she did," Hammer agreed. "And she did it on fumes. Never thought I'd see that." As darkness fell across the base, Ghost found himself sitting alone on the flight line, watching mechanics work by floodlight on his damaged Warthog. The adrenaline had completely worn off now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made every muscle ache. He thought about Alina and Sarah. He thought about the email that had started his day. his daughter making the soccer team, his wife asking if he'd be home for her first game. He thought about the promise he'd made to be more present, to be more engaged, to be there for the moments that mattered. And then he thought about Slate 12, 4 young soldiers who would go home because he'd made a choice to ignore protocols and trust his instincts. Those soldiers would have families waiting for them. Those soldiers would tell stories about the day they nearly died and the pilot who refused to let that happen. Among the soldiers who served, the legend of Ghost would grow. Not because of official commendations, those would never come because the operation was classified, but because word traveled in the close-knit community of deployed soldiers. Because stories got told in quiet moments, passed from unit to unit, spread through the grapevine like wildfire. The pilot who ignored orders to save a team. The man who flew on empty and lived to tell about it. The warrior who understood that some things were worth more than regulations, worth more than career advancement, worth more than life itself. Ghost Morrison, Coulson Ghost, the pilot who appeared when you needed him most and refused to let good soldiers die. That reputation would follow him through the rest of his career, whispered in ready rooms and flight lines across every base where American pilots served. As the night deepened and the stars emerged overhead, Ghost sat quietly, watching his aircraft being repaired, and understood the price of the choice he'd made. And he was at peace with it, knowing that somewhere in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, 4 young soldiers were alive because he'd been willing to break the rules. That was enough. That was everything.